tonight's speaker is Rachel Herman. And Rachel Herman is a professionally certified educational therapist and the founder and executive director of Learning for All, an educational therapy and cognitive development. She's over 20 years of professional experience in education, from one-on-one therapy to teaching classes in many subjects, from elementary school through college level, including 6 years of teaching at Point Loma Nazarene University. She has 13 years of experience homeschooling her 3 children, including a son with dyslexia and ADHD. Through Learning for All, she offers struggling learners a personalized approach to education and remediation using systematic, explicit, multisensory protocols that combine our cognitive skills, building with specific academic instruction. Rachel is certified in Barton reading and spelling at the advanced level, handwriting without tears, and is an internationally certified Feuerstein cognitive enrichment practitioner and trainer. She's also a professional member of the Association of Educational Therapists, the National Institute for Learning Development, CHADD, and the International Dyslexia Association. In her free time, she enjoys all things outdoors with her husband and 3 grown sons. Along with her canine partner, Roxy, Rachel is a member of the San Diego Sheriff's Department Search and Rescue Unit. And Rachel has also just become my new hero because, as you guys know, I am also a mother of 3 sons. So, but mine are young, and anybody who's done it is a personal hero of mine. So without further ado, I'm so excited to present Rachel and have her speak with us now.
Thank you, Elisheva. It's such a privilege to be here. I think the Feuerstein community is among my very favorite group of people that I get to work with in the world. And so good morning from California, and wherever you are, I know we have people here from all over the world. So thank you so much for being here, and I'm very excited to share this presentation with you today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And today we're going to talk about dyslexia and cognitive functions. So how can we use FIE, Feuerstein Instrumental Enrichment, to support reading remediation? So just to get started here, Elisheva shared, I am a mother of 3 sons. My sons are all grown now, but Elisheva, I remember that stage of life with having little ones. I miss it. This is actually the reason that I'm in this line of work, that my career kind of took a detour in the middle, and this son of mine was the reason why. Like so many of us here, we have such compelling reasons for doing this work, and there's no more compelling reason than the desire to help your own child who's struggling. So this is my middle son. He's now 23. He's getting ready to graduate from university at the end of the year, which when he was this age, I didn't think that day would ever come. So it really is a miracle, in my opinion. But the quick story is that he was always bright, clearly bright, very verbal, but struggled tremendously with reading and spelling in particular. And so those were red flags that identified his learning challenge. So today, I just want to give you a quick roadmap about what we're going to discuss. First of all, we're going to talk about what is dyslexia, give a definition of dyslexia. How do we identify it in learners? So what kinds of warning signs are we looking for? Then we're going to talk about the cognitive characteristics of dyslexia. So I'm going to be painting with a broad brush. I want to be clear. We're going to be doing some generalizing about these profiles, and we want to recognize that every learner is an individual, and every learner is different. But getting a broad picture of the cognitive profile for learners who struggle with dyslexia is really helpful in terms of developing an effective therapy plan. Then we're going to talk about the impact on cognitive functioning, and we're going to use Professor Feuerstein's 28 cognitive functions in order to do that. And finally, we're going to make a connection with the instruments themselves. and talk about what instruments we might target for a learner who is struggling with reading and spelling, and what specific functions we might want to make sure that we're highlighting as we're using those instruments. So that's what we're going to cover today. We're going to end with some question and answer time. So you can put questions in the chat. Elisheva will be monitoring that and managing that part of our time today. I also want to let you know, though, that I will be asking you some questions. I want to make this as interactive as possible, even though we have a large group. So I'll be inviting you to participate by responding in the chat at different points in the presentation today. All right, so let's get started with what is dyslexia. And I want to start with the caveat here, because we are an international group, that I'm going to be sharing some data that comes from studies that have been conducted in the US. So these studies are with English-speaking learners where English is their first language, and the data comes from the US. But we see similar data in other English-speaking countries. In the UK, in Australia, we have similar data. And we know that dyslexia, a language-based processing disability, impacts all people around the world. So no matter what language, no matter what culture or what country, we might have slightly different data, but the impact is the same. And so the principles that I'm going to be sharing with you today will apply no matter what language or what country you're working with, because essentially dyslexia is a difficulty with translating spoken language into print and translating from printed language into spoken language. And that, of course, is the essence of language in its written form, is the ability to be able to do that. We must be able to move from spoken language, which is a natural part of human development, into written language, which is actually an artificial process that we have invented along with civilization. So if you want to do a deeper dive into that topic, it's really fascinating. Marianne Wolf's work highlights how unnatural reading and writing is for us as human beings, and it makes sense why certain brain organizations are less efficient at that process. So what is dyslexia? This definition is used by government here in the US, the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. And I like it because it covers a lot of different bases for dyslexia. So let's unpack this. There's a lot of language here. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurological in origin. So when we're talking about that term, specific learning disability, that's actually a technical term that we use in the US in our school system for a disability that's related to processing. So this is not an intellectual disability. This is a processing disability, meaning that certain types of information that a learner encounters are not processed well in the brain, or take a less efficient pathway through the brain. And so therefore, it's neurological in origin. Dyslexia is a different brain organization. And we're going to look at a slide in a minute that shows that different parts of the brain are utilized in a person with dyslexia when they're reading than in a neurotypical brain. So it's neurological in origin. It's a different brain organization. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition. So people with dyslexia have a very difficult time typically with visual memory related to words, related to the symbols of language. They often cannot visualize language. So if I ask my learner to spell the word because in English, which is an odd spelling, typically a word we call a sight word, it must be memorized. I can see that word in my mind, and I can picture it, but my learners who struggle with dyslexia cannot picture that word. They will need another strategy in order to be able to spell that word effectively until it really takes root in their long-term memory and they're able to pull it up automatically. So that visualization of words is very difficult. Word recognition. It's characterized by poor spelling and decoding abilities. So we're going to talk a little bit about the two sides of language-based processing. One side is decoding, that's reading. And when I say decoding, the essential skill of reading is taking the code of language, which we are representing with the symbols of the alphabet, okay, and turning that into verbal language. That's what you're doing when you're reading. You're looking at this code and you're turning that into verbal language, decoding. That's one direction the brain has to go. But in order for us to write, which is the flip side of reading, it's the reverse of reading, we have to be able to take that verbal language and now turn it into the symbolic code of written language. Okay, so we call that encoding. We're creating the code for the verbal skill. So both of those skills are typically impacted in a learner with dyslexia. Now, we have learners that with dyslexia that are stronger in reading and weaker in spelling and writing. And we also have the inverse. I have learners that are stronger in spelling and weaker in reading. And so you can have both of those profiles within this whole profile of dyslexia. But in terms of how the brain is functioning, it's one of the most important points is that there's an inability for the brain to go back and forth. So it might be more efficient at one of those processes, encoding or decoding, but it's not necessarily making that automatic connection to the inverse process. So those two elements are characteristic, and they can be stronger or weaker. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language. So we're talking about phonological. We're talking about the sounds that we hear. At its foundation, dyslexia is a difficulty with translating those sounds that we hear, particularly for spelling the parts of words or decoding the parts of words into written language or from written language into verbal. So it's the sounds that we hear. We start with phonological processing. That's always where we start with dyslexia, because that's where we see the foundational deficits. Unless we address those deficits, the ability to break into sounds, manipulate sounds, identify sounds, discriminate between sounds, we will not be able to move to the next part, which is attaching the appropriate symbols to those sounds. A deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. So I want to be clear, there are multiple reasons a learner might struggle with reading. We're going to talk today about dyslexia, which is the most common. It's not the only reason. So that's why we want to look at all of the parts of that learner to determine what the deficit is. But if it's dyslexia, it's not an intellectual disability. In fact, dyslexia most often occurs in learners who have average to high IQ scores. And it's not a learner it's not because, mom didn't read enough to the child when the child was young. The child got poor education in their early schooling. Those are not the reasons that dyslexic learners struggle with language. All of those things can be there, and a learner with moderate to severe dyslexia is still going to have these challenges. The secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede the growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So here in the United States, we spend from the first 3 years really of a child's elementary education, teaching them to read in our school system. So that's kindergarten through 2nd grade. By the time we get to 3rd grade, we're really doing this transition from teaching the learner to read to reading for information. Okay, so instead of learning to read, we say we're reading to learn. And 3rd grade is kind of that transition point. By the time a learner gets to 4th grade, so here that's about 8 or 9 years old, they're no longer getting reading instruction, and they're expected to be able to use reading as a skill, an effective skill for learning. And so if they're not doing that, then we start to see this disconnect with background knowledge, this disconnect with vocabulary. One of the most important things to understand about reading is that the language we use in print is infinitely more complicated than the language that we use in conversation. So even a conversation between 2, university educated adults, even a lecture like this one, where we are going to be using technical terms, and so a wider range of vocabulary, is a fraction of the vocabulary that you would get from reading a book about this topic. And so reading is really what helps learners build vocabulary, not just hearing spoken language. And so when a learner is not reading accurately, fluently, and effectively, their vocabulary is going to be reduced, and therefore their background knowledge. We're going to look at a slide about this in just a minute. So when we see issues with reading comprehension, I mentioned earlier, there are different profiles for learners that are struggling with reading. And a reader, when we're looking at comprehension, we want to ask ourselves, why is this learner struggling with comprehension? And I always am first going to look at the mechanics of reading. If this learner is not accurately decoding language, and they're not doing it quickly enough, and they're not getting to efficiency, if they're too slow or they're inaccurate, that's going to impact comprehension. So the impact of inaccuracy is obvious, right? If we read the words incorrectly or we skip over words, of course, we're going to be missing meaning. The other impact, though, is speed. That's another component of fluency. If we're reading too slowly, or we're reading word for word, we are reading not at a pace, right? If we're reading that slowly, just like if I'm speaking that slowly, by the time I get to the end of my sentence, you're not going to remember what was at the beginning. Our working memory cannot hold that information when it takes too long to get through the system. So speed is the other component of comprehension. That doesn't mean sometimes that a learner with dyslexia doesn't have trouble understanding language if it's spoken. They have trouble understanding it if they're reading it, because they're either inaccurate or they're too slow, or here's the hidden component, it's too effortful. So 3 pieces of efficiency: speed, accuracy, effortfulness. Why effortfulness? Because a learner might be able to read accurately and quickly enough to gain comprehension, but if they can only do it for 30 seconds or a minute, because it requires so much cognitive energy because they have an inefficient process, then as soon as they reach that threshold of effort, now all of a sudden their performance is going to drop off. The only way to fix that is to give them a more efficient process that they can sustain for a longer period of time. So that's one of the places that cognitive skill building with FIE comes in, right? We can help our learners flex that muscle for building mental stamina while we're giving them a more efficient process. So that's the foundational definition of dyslexia. Sometimes the easiest way to understand what something is by looking at what it is not. So dyslexia is not a sign of poor intelligence. We talked about that already a little bit. It's not the result of laziness or not caring. However, that blocking behavior is definitely something that learners develop if they have a pattern of failure. And because reading is such a foundational skill in education and in your academic career, this is often what we see in our learners who are struggling. They become behavior problems. They get accused of not trying because they have some really strong cognitive skills along with some really weak ones. People assume that they should be able to do these skills effectively, right? So therefore, if they're not reading, we know this child is bright. This child isn't reading, this child is lazy. This child doesn't care. I guarantee you our kids care until we teach them not to. They care about being successful in the classroom, about pleasing their parents, with a very minor exception of certain mental issues. Our kids care until we condition them to self-protect by acting like they don't. Dyslexia is not a disease, so it's not something that's cured with pills or with surgery. It's not a lack of educational opportunity. It's not something we cure with pills or diets. We definitely can support the whole learner and all of the body systems organically with multiple things, and that is important. But ultimately, those other things are not the thing that's going to help a learner that's struggling learn to read. It's not an eye problem. In the US, this is the biggest myth about dyslexia, that people with dyslexia see words backwards. They don't see words or letters any differently than anyone else. The problem that people with dyslexia have is remembering the direction of those letters, the ones particularly that are confusable. And it's not something that's outgrown. And this is another myth that we often hear. Oh, this child's just not developmentally ready to read. Eventually the light will come on and all of a sudden they'll take this huge leap, from kindergarten level to third grade level. And that's simply not the case. Can a learner grow? We're going to look at another slide about that in a minute. Will they make progress? Yes. But will it be at the appropriate rate, at the rate that corresponds to their intellectual ability? No, it will not. And so we'll see the learning gap continue to grow over time unless we're addressing the issue of dyslexia. So I want to take a quick look at this slide here of the reading brain. And I mentioned this earlier, that dyslexic readers use a less efficient neural pathway for reading than proficient readers do. So without doing a really deep dive into the slide, we could talk a lot about these images of the brain. What I want you to note is that the top view is the neurotypical brain when it's reading. And this is so amazing. I highly recommend the book that this comes from by Sally Shaywitz called Overcoming Dyslexia. But a lot of the work in that book came out of the seminal fMRI studies that were done, about 20 years ago, I think is when we started doing these studies. And so with the functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, we're able to take a picture of the brain while a learner is doing the task of reading. And so we're able to see what parts of the brain that learner is using for the process. Note that the top shows the neurotypical brain. In neurotypical readers, read entirely with the left side of their brain, and you can see the parts of the brain that light up. If we go down to the bottom image and we look at the brain, the dyslexic brain, notice that the dyslexic learner is using mostly the right side of the brain. And actually notice that both sides of that anterior part of the brain are lit up. We know from our work with cognitive functioning that if we're using both sides of the brain, both hemispheres of the brain, we have to have transfer between those hemispheres in order for that to take place. And so therefore, it's less efficient. The parts of the brain that a learner with dyslexia uses are less efficient for reading. There's more opportunity for glitches to happen in that process. And so therefore, reading is more difficult. Some facts about dyslexia: it's hereditary. So dyslexia is a genetic condition and it occurs on a spectrum. So you can have from mild to profound dyslexia, and you can have, a mildly dyslexic parent with a profoundly dyslexic child, and vice versa. I know that one part of my personal story that I'll just share with you, and it's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this topic, is that my father committed suicide when he was 40. So I was a child when that happened. And he struggled for years. At the time, he was out of work. And now as an adult, looking back at his writing and other artifacts from his life, I am 100% certain that he had dyslexia and ADHD that was never diagnosed. He went to university for 6 years and never got a degree because he could never finish his process. So part of that profile. So dyslexia is hereditary. So I'm sure that's where my son gets it. And that's an example of what happens when we don't address those foundational needs that a learner has. Sometimes it can lead to long-term mental health issues and other issues. Dyslexia occurs on a spectrum. Dyslexia is common. As many as 1 in 5 struggle somewhere on that dyslexia spectrum. It's the most likely reason a learner will be receiving special education, and it's the most likely reason a learner will struggle with reading and spelling. Dyslexia affects males and females equally, all across ethnic, socioeconomic backgrounds, and multiple languages. Dyslexia is often misunderstood and misdiagnosed, especially in learners that are bright and relatively mild, because our bright learners in particular are underdiagnosed because they develop these kind of workaround skills that they can get by. But because they're inefficient, they're working so much harder, and oftentimes they're not working at their full potential because they're not reading efficiently. Dyslexia affects much more than just reading and spelling, and we're going to look at that when we look at cognitive profiles. It can't be cured, but the dyslexic brain can form new neural pathways for learning. So this is where our structural cognitive modifiability enters the picture. We know we can develop those pathways that can help our learners become efficient readers. I just want to share this slide with you, and because this really demonstrates the impact of difficulties in reading, especially throughout a learner's academic career. So on the left-hand side, you'll notice the green graph, and we have the top line, which is cognition, okay, IQ, intellectual ability. And of course, it grows over a learner's career. As a learner develops, their intelligence grows. The bottom line, the dotted line, is reading. Okay, so in a neurotypical reader, we should be seeing the reading skill grow in proportion with the IQ. All right, it's keeping up. Okay, as the IQ grows, the reading skill grows. What happens in a dyslexic learner is on the right, the red. The top line is still that intellectual trajectory. Okay, the IQ. So notice that the IQ trajectory is the same, right? But below we see the reading trajectory. And what happens is, it kind of starts out moving up. And notice that throughout the learner's academic career, it does continue to increase. It does creep up, but it's not tracking with IQ anymore. And so that gap between reading ability and IQ keeps growing. One of the things that happens a lot of times for learners in school is that teachers, especially special ed teachers, say, "Oh, well, he is improving. Her scores are better than they were last year." Okay, and next year her scores are better than they were last year, right? But they're only a little bit better. They're not where they should be on grade level. And over time, that just little bit better increases that gap, because our learner, even though they have average to high IQ, is not able to keep up with the reading side of it. The other point on that slide is notice that that red line for IQ on the top for dyslexic readers has these little arrows that are pointing down. Do you see that? Okay, that's indicating that if we don't fix the reading problem, we're going to start pulling down that IQ because our learner doesn't have access to content, vocabulary, all the information that we gain from reading that stimulates our thinking process. And so eventually that's going to start to pull down our learner's ability to be able to work with concepts. I'm not going to go over warning signs, but we see them very early. Just a couple things. Delayed speech, mixed up speech, confusion between right and left. Oftentimes there's an auditory processing piece. So we might see a history of early ear infections. The inability to rhyme is a big red flag. The inability to break words apart into syllables or individual sounds is a big red flag. Family history, of course, because we know that it's hereditary. Slow, choppy, inaccurate reading. Reading substitutions. When we might see a learner that is reading by using other context clues, which really isn't reading, it's really ends up being guessing. Okay, so we never want to prompt a learner to read by looking at the picture and guessing at the word that should be there. If we see a learner substituting words that are unrelated phonetically because they're looking at the picture, that's a huge red flag for dyslexia. So it's a picture of a boy and he's jumping off the dock into a body of water. And the sentence is, the boy jumped into the lake. And our learner reads, the boy jumped into the pond. Okay, we know they're guessing at that word. They're not related visually, they're not related phonetically, and so therefore they're not reading those more complicated words. Can't remember sight words, doesn't like to read, doesn't want to read out loud, terrible spelling, and often dysgraphia goes along, difficulty with handwriting, so it's that visual motor integration, right? The motor part of creating the symbols, along with the symbol memory itself is impacted. Difficulty telling time on a traditional clock, skipping those little words. Okay, why does a learner do that? Skip those articles, a, and, the. We know our learner can read those words. Why are they missing them or misreading them? Because our learner is looking at the big, scary 3-syllable word that's next to the article, that's next to the preposition. And they're thinking, I can't read that big, scary word. And so they're glossing over the small words because they're spending so much concentration trying to decode that larger word. It ends up impacting other areas. And this I said we would touch on. Anxiety often becomes an issue. If a learner is guessing, that's incredibly anxiety provoking in a school setting, right? I don't have a way to know if I'm right or wrong. Okay, and the classroom's going by quickly. Learners with dyslexia and other processing disabilities often have slow processing. They need that extra think time. And so they're forced to guess. That's a coping strategy. One of the things, so that's kind of the profile and also the early warning signs. I want to shift now to look at kind of creating the larger cognitive picture out of that information. And I put up here Eschers Impossible Figures, because one of the studies that came out, oh gosh, it's probably been 10 years now, actually looked at dyslexic learners and neurotypical learners interpreting Eschers Impossible Figures. In other words, trying to make logical sense of what they're seeing here. And these are so brilliant because we can trace them up to a point, and then, you know, what we thought we were going up, but now we're going down, right? And dyslexic learners actually were the fastest to be able to interpret these figures and kind of make sense out of them. And why do I show you that? actually, because as Professor Feuerstein reminds us, if we're not prepared to look at our pupils' strengths, we don't want to touch their weaknesses. We can't touch their weaknesses. We need to see both sides. So I want to now to kind of give you a cognitive picture of the typical dyslexia profile with respect to both those strengths and those weaknesses. So before we move into using our cognitive functions to interpret, I want to go back to a broader brush here. So if we're looking at the cognitive characteristics of dyslexia, we're again comparing the neurotypical brain to the dyslexic brain. And here by neurotypical brain, what I mean is these are characteristics that are most often associated with intelligence. Okay, this is when a learner can do these things well, we consider them bright. Okay. So what are some of those hallmark things? Precision, right? Accuracy, efficiency, speed, automaticity, meaning that we can immediately pull those things from our long-term memory and use them. Okay, it's that procedural memory, right? We don't have to think about it or analyze it. We can just do it without thinking. Reliability, okay, can we repeat the process the same way every time? And replicability, focus, okay, that's mental stamina, right? Concision, okay, the ability to be concise and reduce ideas and concepts to their most salient and important points, and detailed expertise. Okay, so these are hallmarks of intelligence. Here's what the dyslexic brain does really well. The dyslexic brain gets the gist, okay? Sees the big picture. So whereas people with dyslexia might miss some of the details, they're going to be able to kind of broadly categorize, spot the larger context behind an idea, offer a multi-dimensionality of perspective. One advantage of having this kind of brain organization is mental flexibility, oftentimes. Now, again, broad brush, this isn't true of all of our learners with these profiles. You can also, by the way, have dyslexia and other comorbidities. So you can have dyslexia and ASD. And in that learner, you're probably not going to see the same level of cognitive flexibility. Or you can have one of the most common comorbidities is dyslexia and ADHD. And so, again, this is broad, but I want us to think about categories, and that will help us understand how we can help these learners. So dyslexic brains often have the ability to see new, unusual, or different connections. And so a lot of our most innovative thinkers and entrepreneurs are dyslexic. So think of people like Richard Branson and Steven Spielberg and Steve Jobs. These are really innovative creators in the world, and they're dyslexic. And so, again, it's not just their weaknesses, it's their strengths. It's actually that different brain organization that allows them to think differently and see the world differently. So it's the ability to see new, unusual, and different connections, the ability to use inferential reasoning, right? To gather information that's not explicit. Okay, that's what inferential reasoning is. Ambiguity detection. Okay, the ability to spot lies or things that don't add up. Okay, and almost an intuition about that sometimes. Mindfulness can be a strength, intentionality, and ad hoc problem solving. And what does that mean? That means that the ability to do it differently or come up with novel solutions, especially on the spot. So those are some cognitive characteristics. We're going to go now to cognitive function. So I want you to keep this in mind. And now I'm going to ask you some questions. So, and I'm going to invite you to participate in the chat. So as I said, we're going to be moving on to cognitive functions, and we actually see both deficits and developed areas of functioning in all three of the phases of the mental act. So the breakdown can happen in all of these phases, and so can, that developed ability as well. So I'm actually going to switch now because I think it'll be more efficient if I share a different screen with you. Give me 1 second here. All right. Okay. So here we have Feuerstein's cognitive functions, deficient and developed functions. All right. So I want to start by looking at input. Go ahead and put it in the chat, and you can just use the numbers. Looking at this list, what are some of the areas we would expect to see deficient cognitive functioning in a learner with a dyslexic profile? Throw it in the chat. You can just use the number if you like. 1 and 7, 3. What else? I'll give you a minute. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of ones here. Okay, blurred and sweeping perception. Definitely that is an area where we would expect to see weaknesses in the dyslexic profile. Why? Because as we discussed, the dyslexic brain is very global. It tends to see the whole and not the parts. Okay, if we go back to our profiles for a second, and you can put this in the chat, is the neurotypical profile better at deductive reasoning or inductive reasoning? The neurotypical profile. Deductive or inductive? Remember that deductive reasoning is the ability to take a whole and break it into its parts. Okay, and inductive reasoning is the opposite, the ability to take all these parts and create a whole out of them. Okay, sometimes we call this analysis, breaking down, deductive, and synthesis, pulling all together. Okay. So the neurotypical brain as described, or typical intelligence as described in the previous slide, is mostly deductive. It's about details. It's about parts, precision, accuracy, detailed thinking. Whereas if you're looking at the dyslexic brain, that brain is stronger with induction, with synthesis. It sees the big picture. It gets the gist. It comes up with creative solutions. Okay, it's global. The other type of thinking is more local. Now we need both. So there's no good and bad here. They're just different areas of strength. So what we're going to also find is that blurred and sweeping perception when you're reading is not an advantage. It's a deficient function. If we're being blurred and sweeping and we're skipping important information when we're reading, we're not going to be an effective reader. But if we are trying to, create Virgin Galactic for the good of the world, blurred and sweeping actually might help us because we're able to not get distracted by the details, and we're kind of able to take a sweeping view, a broader view. So sometimes we always think of these as negative. Sometimes it depends on the context, whether a particular deficient skill is negative or not. But with respect to reading, absolutely blurred and sweeping, it's a disadvantage. Other people mentioned 7, imprecise and inaccurate data gathering. Absolutely. Our learners with dyslexia see part of that word. They're skipping over words. They're not taking time to look at all the parts. And so they are inaccurate in that way. I don't know if anybody came up. 4, good. Somebody just put that in there. Lack of spatial orientation. Here's another one that is so fascinating to me. In 2 dimensions, for symbols on paper, dyslexic learners have a very difficult time with spatial orientation. However, there's a reason for that, and it's actually would be in a different context considered a cognitive strength. So learners with dyslexia actually tend to have very high visual spatial reasoning skills for figural information. Okay, they're able oftentimes to see the world in 3 dimensions. So these are our engineers, our architects, people that understand spatial relationships in 3 dimensions. It's the reason that people with dyslexia confuse the English letters B, D, P, and Q. B, D, P, and Q, if you put them in the chat, you could see what I'm talking about, okay, is because it's the same exact shape. It's just a different orientation, right? So if we're to take B, D, P, and Q, those letter symbols in English, and rotate them, right? That's all we have to do to get different letters, but it's the same shape. So learners with dyslexia who see the world in 3 dimensions, they know it's one of those, okay? It's not that they can't identify those letters, it's they just can never remember which one goes which way when you put it 2-dimensionally on a page, right? So it's that 2-dimensional symbol orientation that they struggle with, not that ability to orient in 3 dimensions. So what is a strength in one context becomes a weakness in another. So I'm going to put it as a weakness here, but if we were to look at visual spatial reasoning scores, those tend to be high. So those are some of the disadvantages in input. What would we expect to see? And again, you can use those numbers as developed skills in input. I see 2. What would be some developed skills in input? What would we expect to see a learner do well who has a dyslexic profile? Great, thank you. Yeah, so, and again, we're not going to pick all of them. What are the most important ones? Okay, one of the things that's tricky in working with cognitive functions is we can kind of, they could be all of them, right? In different contexts. We really want to focus on what are the ones that stand out in terms of how we think about the profile. So understanding verbal receptive labels, a few people said. Vocabulary, oral vocabulary, very high typically. So if we're looking at listening comprehension, that often tends to be very high until a learner gets older, and then we see that vocabulary go down because they're not reading. But in younger readers, it's that verbal comprehension that's much, much higher than the reading ability. We also see often a great ability to consider 2 or more sources of information. Again, that's that quality of inductive thinking, okay, that we're able to hold all these pieces together and make something out of them, consider multiple pieces in order to come up with some kind of conclusion. So, and I'm running short on time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit here. I'm going to kind of go through and talk about these, but I want you to be thinking yourself as we're going through about deficient and developed cognitive functions for this profile in both elaboration and output. So the highlights for deficiencies in elaboration that we typically see are the inability to define the problem. So understanding what is required in order to decode or encode accurately. Now that's something that we can explicitly teach very effectively, but when a learner doesn't have that kind of remediation, they're not able to define the problem. Inability to select relevant versus irrelevant cues. And so this we, again, often see in reading, cues about prefixes, suffixes, particularly how those are connected to meaning. We often see a lack of internalization, and I mentioned this earlier, the ability for our learner to be able to take the process inside and do it automatically. You cannot achieve automaticity of a process unless it's internalized. And so, again, visual memory for symbols, very weak in most of these types of learners. Lack of hypothetical testing. So here's really something that's interesting. Is that oftentimes hypothetical thinking is a strength. Hypothetical thinking is a strength. Hypothetical testing is the detailed piece, right? The thinking is the global piece, the ad hoc piece, the creative piece. The testing is the detailed piece, the analytical piece, a piece that requires process, sequential thinking, systematic search, right? A systematic approach. So that's part of the profile here. We also see often a lack of planning behavior. And an inability to label and categorize can be an issue. We see strengths in the areas of summation, right? As you might expect, and this ability to connect and create relationships, okay? That is an area of strength. The flip side of that is the episodic grasp. Because it's a strength, though, sometimes it's hard for our learners with this profile to see those details. All right, we're going to jump over here to output, and we're going to look at the profile here in output, difficulty projecting virtual relationships. So again, that ability to be able to apply things from one context to another when you only have some of the information. Right? When not all of the information is explicit. That's what is required to create virtual relationships that are consistent. We also see a lot of trial and error response. I talked about guessing earlier. This is one of the first things that we have to undo in a learner who's struggling with this process. We have lack of verbal expressive labels. This is another what we call rapid naming. So our dyslexic learners will go, the whatchamacallit, the thingamajig, the thingy over there, right? So oftentimes what happens when we're working with these kind of learners is parents especially, or family members or classmates will supply that language, right? We know what they're thinking. We know the word they're trying to pull, but we don't let them pull it. We give it to them. And when we're doing that, we're undermining their ability to develop this skill of verbal expressive labels. Precision and accuracy and response related to that, and visual transport. If you have trouble with language processing in general, your ability to be able to look at something on the board and copy it below is going to be very difficult because, again, you're not internalizing it. Probably the biggest strength that we see in output is the ability to consider another point of view. And that, again, is part of that creative and ad hoc thinking process. All right, I'm going to flip back to here. I know we just have a few more minutes. Elisheva, are we okay to go maybe 5 more minutes? Okay, all right. So I'm going to stop that.
Rachel, if you have a minute at the end, if you would show that screen in its totality, we could take a screenshot of it so that we could see how you coded, because we never got to see all 3 phases at the same time and how you coded it. And people could take a screenshot and have it instantly.
Love it. I'll do that, Jeannie. Thank you. If I don't, remind me.
Okay.
Here we are. Okay. Are you guys seeing the PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. All right. So we just all right. The last piece I want to do is is connect this to how do we help these learners? How do we help these learners? I want to be super clear about this. From my experience, in order to help a learner who is struggling with reading, they must use a specific reading and spelling protocol that is that works on these skills. We use FIE to support this, and using FIE can drastically improve a learner's cognitive functioning and therefore their ability to be able to use the reading program effectively. But if a learner has really any level of dyslexia from moderate to profound, they are going to need a specific reading program in order to be able to do that efficiently, not just FIE. They're going to need both of those together. So I want to show you how those things work together. They're going to need a reading program that has these characteristics. It needs to be evidence-based. It needs to be multisensory. It needs to be integrated together, so that and by that I mean that we are doing these multisensory pieces simultaneously, so that the brain has more sensory hooks to hang on to that information. It needs to be systematic. It needs to build upon itself. And this is where this is going to be a little different than the work that we do with FIE, because we're not necessarily being systematic with FIE. In fact, sometimes it's not being systematic that challenges the brain to grow, right? The novelty, the idea of novelty that's required to develop cognition. In reading remediation, we need repetition, and we need a system that builds upon itself. It needs to be sequential, and it needs to be mastery based, also different than cognitive skills. So we're not looking for mastery of everything. We don't move on from a DOTS page only when the learner can do it with 0 errors. Okay, we use those errors to teach, but in reading, we want it needs to be mastery based. It needs to be 90% or above before we introduce the next skill, or our learner is going to continue to have gaps in their understanding. And it needs to be explicit. Our learners who struggle with dyslexia do not pick up intuitively the code of language or the rules of language. We must teach those explicitly in a sequential and systematic way in order for them to be able to remember those principles. All right, so how does this relate to FIE? We can use a lot of different instruments, as you know, to target a lot of different areas of cognitive functioning, and that, of course, is the brilliance of the instruments. That so many of them target so many different areas of cognitive functioning, and it's really the skilled mediator that decides how we want to target using the instruments as our foundation. So I like to think about this in 3 different phases for reading. And again, these are not the only instruments that you can use. You can use all the instruments in different ways, but these are the ones I like to target because, coming back to our functions, these are the ones that are going to work on those deficiencies. So I always like to start first with organization of dots, as most of us do, for all the reasons, right, that we're able to effectively use that. It really targets some of the most foundational pieces, which is blurred and sweeping perception, lack of systematic search, incomplete data gathering, selecting relevant versus irrelevant cues, planning behavior, trial and error response, projecting virtual relationships, all of those things, and visual transport. Those areas are going to be targeted by dots. I like to start dots simultaneously with orientation in space. This is one of the most brilliant instruments to use early on for a learner with dyslexia, because the instrument goes from 3-dimensional representation to 2-dimensional representation, right? From a less abstract task to a more abstract task, taking what is actually these learners' strengths understanding the world in 3 dimensions, and now having to be able to symbolically represent that. That is at the heart of our learners' struggle with directionality for symbols. So I love orientation in space for that. So it works on the kind of, it uses the strong part of their spatial orientation to work on the weak part of their spatial orientation. Defining the problem, internalization, and again, that visual transport is targeted there. Perhaps the most important middle instrument to use then would be analytic perception. Why? Because analytic perception works on deduction and induction, and it forces us to constantly go back and forth between deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. We have to take these images and break them into their parts, and then we have to pull them together and create a whole. Analysis, synthesis, analysis, synthesis. So here, again, we're using a dyslexic learner's strength with spatial reasoning because it's figural information. It's not verbal. So the key to making this instrument effective for readers is the bridging and transcendence that happens out of that process. So they need to be able to understand the analysis versus synthesis. It'll be easier for them to do analysis with figural information, even though that's weak. And then what do? We bridge it. We translate that skill to, now let's do it with words, right? Can we take this word and break it apart? Can we take this word and put it back together? That's decoding and encoding, or reading and spelling. So I like to do analytic perception by itself so I could really lean into that and really get the most out of that instrument. And finally, in phase 3, we're going to be looking at things like categorization. Again, in categorization, we're doing deductive and inductive skills, those two, the inverse. Instructions is a huge one for our learners with dyslexia. How do I take what I'm visually seeing and put words to it, verbalize it, or write about it? And finally, representational stencil design for similar reasons to analytic perception, identifying relevant versus irrelevant cues, hypothetical testing, systematic search, and then data gathering. In all of these instruments, we're going to be looking for precision and accuracy in both input and output, because we're going to see that both of those are weak, and those are things that we want to target. So thank you for hanging in there with me. I know I went a little bit over time. Elisheva, do we want to open it up for questions? Oh, and Jeannie asked about, I'll throw that other slide up there so you can take a screenshot.
Okay, we definitely do want to open it up for questions. This is why I always call it a flex hour. So yes, anybody have any questions? Please, please speak. We love the wow, we love the comments and the thank yous, but any questions while we've got Rachel here?
Hi, I just had a question. Rachel, are you teaching or having your tutors use the FIE as a, I don't know, like as an explicit program with your young learners or adults? How is it actually like embedded in your work?
Sorry, I lost you there for a second. Can you hear me now, Elisheva?
Yeah.
Am I back on? Okay. I did hear the question. Give me just a I think the question was about how do we use FIE. So we at Learning for All, in my practice, all of our learners have 2 pieces to their therapy plan. They have a cognitive skills piece and they have a specific remediation piece. So there's an academic component that's targeting weak academic skills or functional skills for adults, like executive functioning, those kinds of things. And there is a cognitive skills piece. So FIE we often use as that cognitive skills piece. But really, for us, one of the things that the ways we've been able to see the most progress, it's because we're integrating those together. And what does that allow us to do? The Barton Reading and Spelling, which is the remediation program that we use for reading, even though it's remedial, it's very intensive. So if you're using, if you're English speaking and your learner is dyslexic, you're going to use one of the Orton-Gillingham based reading protocols. Okay, Orton-Gillingham is the term for it. There are multiple ones. We use Barton in my practice. But the compensating skill, if you're struggling with reading, is reasoning. That's the compensating skill. We teach rules that are flexible, not memorization, because our learners can't memorize all the words. They need a rules-based, flexible process. And so that is reasoning. That's not the right program if you have a learner who has broad intellectual delays. I would use something different for that. But for our learners with this profile, it's using that Orton-Gillingham system. So where does the FIE come in, or the cognitive skills? Because sometimes that reasoning is also weak, right? And if our reasoning is weak, we're going to hit a ceiling with the reading where we can't progress beyond it. So we have to build the reasoning as we work on the reading. Those things go together, and it's the integration of that allows our learners to reach higher levels of cognition, which then allows them to use these other skills that we're teaching more effectively and become independent learners, right? Because we want to constantly be moving our mediation back from them so that they can start to do these things independently.
Okay, let's have Julia, Hannah, and then I'll read some of the comments from the chat.
Hi, Rachel. Thank you so much for this. This is coming at a good time. I'm starting to work with a little girl again who profoundly has ADHD and dyslexia. Now, we always have the medication side, the medical side as well, the portion of what is your take? How do you feel about the child having to take something to help them with their regulation? Because that is the memory part that is so impeded as well. They struggle to remember. And that is the big problem with dyslexia too.
Yeah, you can't remember what you can't pay attention to. So attention, if we look at like a pyramid of learning, that's one of the foundational blocks. So if you can't attend to something, you cannot learn. That has to be there. With respect to medication, that really is not my area of expertise. So I'm going to kind of answer that question not as an expert on medication. But I have experience with learners where that medication is required to reach a level of regulation where we can start working on the skill. And so, that's a personal decision that families make, doctors make. We work with a lot of learners who are not medicated. My son never had medication for ADHD. And because I homeschooled him, I was able to do school while he was walking around the room or, in the on the couch, standing on his head with his legs over the back. We were able to still get a lot done that way. But it's hard in the classroom, obviously, to do that. So whether or not a learner is on medication, we still want to develop organic skills around attention. So we can grow that sustained attention. We teach the skills to do it. And that, to me, as a therapist, is the most important thing. How am I teaching them skills for sustained attention and growing that? And ultimately, hopefully they can, reduce that medication, maybe with a goal of getting off of that medication, if that's their goal.
Yeah. And another question of the producing of schoolwork in class, they cannot produce their work as quick because they can't read. They struggle to write. Is there a program that you can suggest where they can have the fluency in class of being independent and being able to join in the work, other than a program, other than using a laptop where they can sound produce and type?
Great question. And so that now we're talking about the difference between creating accommodations for a student to learn in a classroom environment and remediation. So we never want accommodations to replace remediation. So we don't want to have accommodations instead. And often in our school system, that's what happens, especially with older learners, because the school has either given up on actually teaching them to read, or they just simply don't have the resources available in like our middle and high school system. And so a lot of those learners, they just get accommodations, which are workarounds, right? They're crutches for the weak skill. So we don't want them to have crutches for the weak skill in lieu of actually learning the skill. However, because for this profile, the deficits are so specific. Here's the other thing that happens. We pull them out of class, they get their language arts block in class, and then we pull them out of all the other content subjects and do more language arts, So we'll take them out of PE. That's the biggest mistake ever if your learner has ADHD. Physical education, we never want to take them out of that. We take them out of history or science or art. We take them out of content areas and enrichment areas to do more reading. And when we do that, we start to pull that cognitive scale down, especially if our reading that we're doing all this extra work on isn't effective. And that's another problem here. So what I recommend is that they need to work on their reading. They need to do it with somebody who's skilled and effective. It needs to be one-on-one. It needs to be at least 2 to 3 times a week. And it needs to have all the qualities on that slide that are effective for remediation. But what we need to do in school then is enable them to get the content. How do we do that? Audiobooks are a huge component of that. So I want my learners who, as they're learning to read, I wait till they get to a certain point in their skill level to introduce independent reading of uncontrolled text. Why do I do that? Because they're going to guess. If I give them words they can't decode, I haven't taught that skill yet, they're going to guess at that language. And I have to undo the guessing in order to get them to decode accurately. So what do? Do I keep them at, do I keep my 5th grader at a 1st grade reading level because that's all they can accurately decode? No, because they're intellectually ready for those 5th grade concepts and they need them. So how do I support that? With audiobooks for textbooks, audiobooks for literature. I'd actually rather have them be listening to books at a higher intellectual level, right? Way beyond their reading level, because that's how we're going to keep the conceptual process going. Also, we're going to keep learning exciting, right? Yeah. If they are reading Cat in the Hat every year, for 4 years, of course they're going to hate reading and hate school and think it's stupid. So we have to keep them growing intellectually while we're supporting it. Other supports then, Julia, would be having a scribe, doing some of their responses orally, being able to type is important, but we don't want them to always have the spelling. I want to teach the spelling. Eventually, they can use the red squiggles to check their spelling. But if they start there, most of my learners with moderate to severe dyslexia, their spelling isn't even close enough to use the spell check in Microsoft Word. Okay, so we have to give them foundational skills, and then they have to learn to become systematic to click that drop down and read all the choices and select the right one. Okay, so there's multiple steps that have to happen there, but we want them to be able to not only gather content, but be able to express what they know. Okay, if the science test is only written and they can't have a reader, or they have to respond essay format by writing, for learners with dyslexia, it becomes a reading test or a writing test. It has nothing to do with what they know about science. If I ask them the question, they're going to answer it correctly because they know the science. They just can't read it off the page or give it back to me in a paragraph.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, I don't even think I need to read the questions because I think you covered everything in your explanation to Julia. I think we hit just about everything. Wait, maybe there's one thing we didn't hit. Hold on a second. 1 second. I can't even see it because they keep getting bumped. But yeah, everything you're saying, how, reading can help, get to a higher level and affect the dyslexia. People, you were asking how often should you do it? You addressed that. I really think that we've covered it all. I mean, thank you so much, Rachel. That was an amazing lecture, an inspiring lecture. I hope you'll come back and speak to the community again in the future because we would be so honored. And yeah, just thank you so much. And to all of you, thank you for joining us tonight. My tonight, your today, your tomorrow, whatever. It's always great to see all of you. And we had a really big crowd this week, which was so exciting. And for those of you who are new and found us, welcome. We do this almost every week. It's ironic I say that this week because next week we probably will not meet. I am going to be on a plane, but we will meet the 2 weeks after. So I'll send you all the email. For those of you who asked, will you get a recording of this lecture? Yes, you will. We will send it to you tomorrow. We always send it the day after the lecture. And now that we also have it available in Italian, we also send it to you in Italian, so you can watch the recording again. And Rachel, maybe we could get a copy of the presentation.
Great. Yes, I can send you the slides. And Elisheva, before, I don't know if you're gonna. I would love to be able to read through the chat because I wasn't able to do that. So I don't know if there's a way to save off the chat so that I can read through. Okay,
I'm gonna try to save it and send it to you.
If any of you have questions directly for me, I'm happy to correspond by email. So please feel free to do that. I'll throw my email in the chat. So please feel free to reach out if you have follow-on.
Tomorrow.
Perfect. Okay. Sounds good.
Yep.
Thank you so much for having me.
Everyone can be connected to Rachel. And yes, thank you. Thank you for being here. It was so special to have you. All right.
Thank you.
All right, I'm sorry, I'm reading more. I'm going to try to just get the chat. We're going to try to answer everyone's questions. Thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you all again very soon.